Well, on the 27th of April, 1994, South Africa finally shook off the shackles of apartheid when millions of formerly oppressed people cast their votes for the first time. Among them, Nelson Mandela, the man who would become the nation's first democratically elected president. 30 years later, however, and with another election on the horizon, we're now taking stock of the gains of democracy and what has not changed. Ziyanda Ngcobo reports.
Stirring words, iconic images seen the world over as South Africa ushered in a new era of democracy 30 years ago. But 3 decades later, as electioneering continues ahead of the May 29th polls, the promise of a better life for all remains elusive for some. The early days of democracy were euphoric. In those formative years, Madiba magic turned everything the nation touched into gold. Just over a year after the Springboks' first World Cup victory on home soil, Madiba was at it again when he signed the country's constitution into law.
It is a good working document. In practice, I can say that as a constitutional lawyer, it is constitutionally an extremely satisfactory document. It is clear, it is precise, it is unbending in its statements of principle.
Democracy had its spoils, particularly in the first decade. An array of infrastructure projects, including new roads, suburbs and towns, led to a boom in the economy. But it wasn't all rosy. A faceless enemy in the early 2000s threatened to undermine the euphoria of the 90s.
A new generation, paying for the mistakes of the old. Most of South Africa's 1.5 million orphans lost their parents to AIDS, and many more are HIV positive. But health workers say the government could have done much more to prevent the catastrophe.
We behaved as though we were the first country on the sub-Saharan continent to be infected, not the last.
While the Madiba magic seemed to lose its shine, it still had enough sparkle to clinch the country one of its greatest achievements yet.
The 2010 FIFA World Cup will be organized in South Africa.
Also playing a unifying role is arts and music, which became a powerful tool to communicate the armed struggle of the liberation movement. Now it has evolved into expressing a narrative of a once oppressed nation that's now reclaiming its history, heritage and culture. The art gallery at the University of Johannesburg is doing exactly that, with its exhibition of Makgabo Helen Sibidi's work. It tells the story of a domestic worker turned artist whose 28 lost artworks were only recently recovered in Sweden after 32 years. Berman, who herself left the country at the peak of apartheid in the 1980s, recalls how Mandela visited the US shortly after his release, calling on South Africans to return home.
I think arts and culture has always played the most vital role for democracy in South Africa. I mean, the anti-apartheid movement to this moment, I think South Africa's arts and culture has really given expression to the world about our democracy, about our constitution, just even the way the new constitution and the constitutional court holds the artwork of South Africans is very much an expression of democracy and our constitution.
But then, the promise of democracy turned to mirror the horrors of apartheid. In 2012, just shy of 2 decades of freedom, a peaceful expression of workers' rights, as enshrined in the Constitution, turned into a bloody nightmare in full view of the world.
The President-elect, would you please raise up your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
2 decades since the dawn of democracy, the country had lived through nearly a decade of crippling corruption by the organizations they had once trusted to lead them into prosperity. Added to that was a growing lack of service delivery, then came state capture. The national mood had lost its zeal.
We're following up with countries to get more information about what happens about each case and the outcome.
Continued economic stagnation on the march to the 3rd decade of freedom made fighting the coronavirus pandemic all the more difficult.
It will turn out to be a national crisis, and we do need to keep our people informed. And it will have huge impacts on a number of things. It will have huge impacts on travel. It will have a negative impact also on our economy, which, as we all know, is in a very, very precarious situation.
The maturing democracy also meant testing the limits of the Constitution. But what the authors of the document could never have predicted was the arrest of a former struggle hero and president.
It is declared that Mr. Jacob Zuma is guilty of the crime of contempt of court for failure to comply with the order made by this court in Secretary of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, corruption and fraud in the public sector, including organs of state, versus Jacob Zuma. Mr. Jacob Zuma is sentenced to undergo 15 months imprisonment.
What followed next shook the country to its core.
Question of taking the law in your own arm is something that needs to be avoided.
Right now we are dealing with a situation that goes beyond ethnic mobilization.
Over 350 people were killed in those unrests which lasted around 2 weeks. The nation continues to reel from the July unrest, which also exposed weaknesses in our intelligence services. Despite the tougher time of the last decade of democracy, South Africa and her people remain a country of hope, resilience, and perseverance. And with yet another landmark election looming, perhaps a new political arrangement is on the cards for the country like it was in 1994. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Ziyanda Ngcobo in Johannesburg.